So, hello everybody, thank you from my side as well. My name is Lars Brozus, I'm with the German Institute on International and Security Affairs, SWP, in German is Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. And this institute is a research institution that its mandate is to advise German policy making on all issues related to foreign and security policy. So we are very much restricted in what we are supposed to work on, and that's only, so to speak, international politics. So this might explain why this is the focus of what I'm talking about. And I want to start off with what Helge Braun yesterday said when he opened the conference. He kind of urged us to do more to help policymakers when they have to decide about the future. For instance, where to invest, in which technologies to invest, and in which coalitions to invest, if you think about international politics, for instance, to think about where to invest, what to do about the major challenges. You know, climate change is the most obvious one, of course. And I think this is kind of mirrored in the title of the presentation that I'm giving to you, improving the policy relevance of futures analysis with a certain focus on international politics or geopolitical crisis, so to speak, because that, I think, is the most visible problems that we have at the moment. Okay, so I think Roberto said this in his presentation as well. The 21st century is really full of unexpected events in international politics. We had so many disruptions, starting with 9/11, of course, you are aware of that, the global financial crisis, the following Eurozone crisis, the Arab Spring, the rise of IS, the annexation of Crimea, the migration and refugee crisis, the Brexit referendum, the Trump presidency, the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan is probably the latest major surprise that we have encountered. And if you think more deeply about them, if you retroactively analyze them, then very often you find that these surprises are not really genuine surprises. There's hardly any in this list of events that I put here. And probably the most unsurprising surprise of the 21st century so far is COVID-19. So it's the pandemic. So you all know there have been so many predictions about a pandemic in the last 20 years. A very famous one, for instance, the TED Talk Bill Gates gave in 2015, which is really probably one of the most cited predictions of a pandemic. And so that you really wonder, why were we not prepared better? And why are we surprised time and again? That's the question that policymakers pose to us, the futures community, I would argue. And we are kind of sometimes telling them, well, we told you so, because we can show you that we had some predictions, that we had some scenarios out there that were, for instance, pointing at a pandemic. It might occur, or it probably will occur sooner or later. And this is kind of a non-productive exchange that very frequently happens between what we are doing as advisors, or what I'm doing as an advisor for international politics, and my audience, so the policymaking audience. And I was thinking, can we not move beyond this blame game, so to speak, or shouting match? They are shouting at us, why didn't you warn us? And we are shouting back, you didn't listen to what we were telling you. That's not very effective. And I think one of the reasons why we have this this greater interest now in policymaking about futures and how to get better at anticipating futures is that we can clearly observe a cumulative effect of all these geopolitical surprises that I've been talking about here on domestic politics, but also on international cooperation. For instance, take the decline in multilateralism that we are all concerned about. This can be attributed, at least in parts, to for instance, the rise of populist movements, be it in the UK, be it in the US. And the rise of populist movements in the UK and in the US can in turn be attributed to the global financial crisis from 2008 onwards. So not being aware or not being able to deflect a geopolitical crisis has costs for policymaking. And these costs can turn out to be prohibitive. So why is anticipatory governance so difficult? Well, as I told you, there are, of course, conflicting logics of, or rather at the science policy interface. First of all, a quote by Michael Mazar: "Awareness does not eliminate surprise." That is what I was talking about. There have been warnings out there, there have been predictions out there, but they are not really taken to be that urgent. And the question is, why are they not being taken as being urgent? And of course, there is motivated reasoning and wishful thinking in policymaking. That is, we find that everywhere in everyday policymaking. That's not that important. But I think it's also a problem of being too unspecific for policymaking purposes. And we sometimes talk among each other in futures research that we have to do more, that more is better. We need more scenarios, we need more complexity, we need more ideas of what might lie ahead. But for me, the question is, what if we have so many what-if scenarios out there? What if there are too many what-ifs? Can there be kind of an information overload that paralyzes policymaking, that paralyzes decision-making in politics? And yes, there's some research out there that shows us that if there is too much analysis, then it gets very easy for policymakers to choose among the analysis they want to base their policies on. And that might not be the most appropriate policies that are chosen among them. So paralysis through analysis is really a problem. It's a practical problem for policymaking. But again, it's a function of throwing too much information at the policymaking community. And of course, there are different priorities as well. We have the analytical criteria, the likelihood of occurrence and expected damage. This is the most simple that you can have when you think about future geopolitical crisis. How likely are they to occur and what is the expected damage that we face? But there are also political criteria, and we tend to underrate them. So it's about visibility of the problem. Is it visible for particularly for the public audiences that policymakers are focused on? Do viable policy options exist at all? Not for every problem there's a political solution at hand. Of course, we have to talk about resource requirements. How much will it cost to do something, and what else will we not be able to do because we have invested the resources differently? And always keep in mind it's about the future, so things might turn out quite differently. And then there is reputational benefits and cost. It's about claiming credit and shifting blame, which is very important for political bureaucracies. And plus likelihood of occurrence and expected damage, of course. They are not unimportant. I wouldn't say that for policymakers. So because the future is so uncertain, and maybe as Roberto told us, it's turning out to be even more uncertain and more complex, what do policymakers do? Very often they turn to analogies. So they use analogies as a standard political heuristic. So what they are thinking about is, well, what did we have in the past? What have we experienced? And can we infer from past action and past occurrences of events what will happen next? And that is very interesting because there you can see some learning pathologies. Take the example of COVID-19. As you all know, early 2020, no one really knew what to do. And if we take a look back now, we can see that some governments were better than other governments in reacting to COVID-19. And in particular, Taiwan and South Korea are cases in point here. They reacted more quickly, more nimble. They were anticipating better in a way, and they had the structures to do this because they were exposed to severe outbreaks of SARS-related viruses in the past that did much more damage in Taiwan and South Korea than the same virus did in Europe or in the US. And that, of course, is a very simple analogy that you can draw. Okay, we have had it in the past, we know it's important, we know it's dangerous, so we should do something about it, and we should keep the provisions that we took in 2009, we should keep them in place. The situation in Europe is somewhat different. We had the swine flu scare in 2009. This is a headline of Der Spiegel, which is one of the major publication outlets here in Germany. And they investigated what they called the swine flu panic. Maybe you remember that as well. What happened is we had the occurrence of the swine flu, 2009. We had the first time, I think in more than almost 50 years, the WHO declared a pandemic situation worldwide. And lots of vaccines were bought by governments, for instance, the German governments. Turns out the swine flu was not as bad, not as dangerous as expected. So we didn't need these stocks of vaccines after some time, and then we simply threw them away or sold them away. And that is an experience that gets into the collective memory of political actors and institutions, bureaucracies. So by drawing the same analogy, it wasn't as bad. It turned out to be not as bad as predicted by a lot of people at that time. Is now, or is in 2020, one of the reasons why we were not that good prepared as other governments. We even had an inquiry from the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly into the handling of the H1N1 pandemic, which complains that, pharmaceutical companies were very active in selling their vaccines to kind of scared or maybe even panicking policymakers, and were successful with that. So clearly a learning pathology that we have here. And in some parts of the world, okay, they were prepared better, but in other parts of the world, not that good because of analogical reasoning. And of course, we all know future challenges are really numerous. This is just from the World Economic Forum's 2020 risk report, 30 of the most important future risks in 2020. Maybe interesting here is that you have infectious diseases over there. So this report has been produced in 2019, and they put the likelihood, so the axis here. As you can see, it's not the expert that they were asking did not perceive the risk of infectious diseases for the next year as being that likely, but impact they were pretty good, I would say. So, but these are just 30 of the major risks, yeah, and they are not only numerous; they are also complex because they are interrelated. Feline pointed out that I don't have that much time left, so I will speed up a little bit. Yes. Okay, so what can we do? Structuring futures complexity in a governance-friendly way. That's the idea that I'm coming up with. And the first, it's quite simple. I think what we have to think more about is about our policy audiences. We have, of course, governments, but we also have the legislatures. We have parliaments, for instance. And what I think is that governments are particularly interested in getting advice on what they should prepare for concretely. So what they are interested in is more like explorative futures analysis. And that can, for instance, be forecasts. Very, very simple. Whereas parliaments, as a deliberative body, are more interested in normatively charged futures. They are more interested in thinking about desirable and undesirable futures. So are, of course, public audiences. So we had in Germany, we had this citizens' assembly that talked about or deliberated about Germany's role in the world this year. And they produced a report which was given to the German parliament and is now being, whatever it's happening to them, to the report there. As Roberta rightly said, many reports are just end up in drawers, of course. But anyway, this might be a simple distinction between the audiences that we are addressing, which has methodical consequences. So if we take for the example of foresight scenarios, that might be more appropriate for deliberative bodies, whereas forecasting, call them tournaments or prediction markets, might be more interesting for government because they want to be quite certain that what they are doing is the right thing to do, of course. And a simple typology of the geopolitical events can show the difference here, I think. So we have unexpected results, over here, of geopolitical events. So the Brexit referendum. The thing is not the referendum as such, that wasn't a surprise, but the result was a surprise. Ukraine's refusal to sign the EU association agreement in 2013, that there were negotiations about this agreement, that wasn't a surprise, but the result, the refusal of former President Yanukovych to sign it, that was a surprise. The same with the Copenhagen Accord on Climate Change, 2009. The negotiations were not the surprise, but the result is a surprise. And of course, if we extrapolate into the future, what happens if Le Pen wins the presidential elections in France next year? So this is one class of events that we are facing. Another class of events, the anticipatable or expectable developments. Popular revolts in the MENA region, 2011. Well, we had many reports about the, as Edgar knows, many reports about the unrest and the dissatisfaction in the region about the state of governance at that time. Global economic and financial crisis. Well, these happen frequently. You cannot really predict, well, some people are better at predicting them than others, but we know that they are bound to happen. We may not know exactly when, but we know that they are bound to happen. Refugee and migration crisis, kind of a result of the civil wars that were in turn a result of the popular revolts of the Arab Spring. And of course, we could ask here for the next pandemic. So these events are anticipatable, expectable, general knowability, but limited predictability. And then we have the real outliers, the genuine surprises, 9/11, Russian annexation of Crimea, the fall of the Berlin Wall. These are the events that even retrospectively, when you are analyzing what kind of information was out there, hardly any pointed in this direction. Talking about the future, why free and fair elections in China would be something that would really surprise us, I guess. And it might be in the interest of the Communist Party to hold them because they might win them, even if they were really competitive elections. Okay, as you probably have been thinking about right now, of course, these are the three swan types that I'm referring to. So white, gray, and black swans. The white swan events like the election outcomes or growth rates for economics, the gray swan events like pandemics or political crisis, and of course the black swan events. And we could try to deal with them differently. It's about trying to predict as good as possible, like white swan events. It's about imagining gray swan events, and it's about red teams that are supposed to hunt for black swans. So and this is my last final slide. So 3 pillars of anticipatory governance could be, I think you could put them like this. So effective and legitimate. So it's both. It's about effectiveness and it's about legitimacy. Anticipatory governance has to institutionalize predictive as well as prescriptive futures analysis. Forecasting geopolitical events, particularly relevant for governments, for decision makers or decision takers that have to act on short-term predictions, and foresight primarily for more normative deliberations about the mid to long-term developments, so maybe 5 to 10 years out there. Okay, and that's the ideas that I'm happy to present here. Thanks.
Thank you, Lars. Now I wonder how this relates to Auftragstaktik. Maybe we can also think about this in the discussion. Okay, we have 15 minutes until the coffee break to discuss a bit. Are there any questions or comments on Eric here?
Sorry, I'm taking a bit, maybe too much time here, but well, as also not only president of the federation, but also as a public servant for many, many years, who actually been trying to create these kind of activities within the public administrative system. So I recognize a lot of those topics that you raised, and I appreciate very much that your presentation, because I think you pinpointed on some very, very crucial issues. And one of them is, of course, the fact that I cannot come to my minister with 5 scenarios because it is a lot of information. I really have to prepare it for the decision makers. And the process from this broadening up foresight activities to try to reflect some ongoing processes to possible decision making is a very, very crucial one, and it's also maybe one of the most difficult one to conduct. So if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on that, because in my opinion, we have tried to create scenarios which is very close linked up to some possible decisions too. So it's also it's a matter of trying to find an approach for also the foresight process that suits the decision-making context in a better way. Thank you.
Should we connect or?
No.
Okay. Yeah. What I think is very positive is that by now, I would say most of the governments are very well, at least democratic governments are very well aware of the scenario methods. So they use them, they employ them, and I think they know about the limits and they know about the advantages of this method. What I kind of worry about is that maybe because of the success of the method, what at least in my view is needed, political action, is maybe benefit, or rather the lack of political action in certain domain areas is able to hide behind scenarios, because scenarios are not uniformly directed in one, in one way. There are competing scenarios out there. There must be competing scenarios out there. So it's a kind of this pick and choose approach. So what you were saying, Eric, is you were trying to kind of nudge the decision maker in a certain direction by maybe prioritizing certain scenarios that you think are more important than other ones, which is of course very, very normal. What we all are trying to. We had the discussion yesterday in the panel on military affairs as well. So I think it's not enough to say, well, we are just giving information to decision makers. We should be also reflecting about our predispositions when we frame this information. And we can do this openly. I think it's not a problem. I think it's about openly structuring and maybe even curating information. And then it depends again, I think, on what we are talking about. If we are talking about the EU in 2035 or Spain in 2050, of course, it's okay, we can do this, it's very hard to do it, but this is a different audience, in my view, than the decision maker who is interested in, should I prepare, what's the next pandemic, what will the next pandemic look like? Do I have to order vaccines now? Do I have to give out orders, or not orders, but to research projects focusing on this and that? And if you have this experience, it went wrong, or it wasn't, we didn't need it one time. This is very hard to overcome. So how do you convince policymakers to make the right decisions, so to speak? And yes, we can be open, and of course we should be open about the limits of the method that we are employing. But every time we say, well, this is just, it's not just some thoughts that we are having. It's more than this, because it's a lot of condensed knowledge that goes into scenarios when they are probably done, of course. But again, we hand policymakers the instruments to say, well, this is one idea among many others, and I have so many different ideas and proposals on my table. How am I supposed to know if this is the right decision to take? So deflecting the importance of scenarios is typical, I would say, for at least in governments. Not so much in parliaments. I think parliaments are much more open. I think the Finnish example is very interesting in this respect, and we will have this with Jana, I think. So I'm being very open here. I think it would be a good idea to talk more about probability and likelihood. And we have some methods out there that are tested and that have produced quite impressive results. forecasting tournaments, the British platform, Cosmic Bazaar, prediction markets that tend to be better than all other kinds of information assembling and analysis that are out there. Like, for instance, intelligence services that have access to classified material. So I'm simply wondering why we are not using these methods more.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I have one question about your discussion about analogies as standard. And do you think there are limits for creativity? Because actually you discussed normative scenario, that could be a debate, and sometime in Foresight we discuss the disruptive scenario and the tendencial scenario. And I just thinking about the limitation of creativity of decision maker, because there is a short term to decide, etc. So what is your, maybe your argument about, is it good? Is it, what can we do with that?
I think analogical reasoning is a shortcut. It's a shortcut that saves time and that is therefore very useful for policymakers. It's not the best way to think, obviously. Wouldn't have kind of wrong decisions if it would be a perfect way to do this. But it's very convenient. So probably the most important thing would be to give policy-making authorities more time to think more deeply about what they are dealing with. But that's not very, yes, you are laughing and you rightly so. That's hard to imagine. So again, what might help here is if we could come with probabilities that have been tested, or the methods that produce these probabilities have been tested, that might enable policymakers to make a decision and to justify it better than just extrapolating from the past. Because very often I think the problem that policymakers face is, how do I justify my decision? So they know that it can be wrong, okay, that happens, but I think they would be served by being able to justify the decisions by, for instance, saying, this is the best available knowledge about the future that is out there right now. It has been produced by the most advanced methods. These methods have been tested. They are transparent. They are checked regularly. So they may still be wrong, but it's the best thing that we have at hand. It's the best instrument that we can use, rather than kind of helplessly returning to analogical reasoning. Well, it has been so in the past, so yes. Because right now what they always can say is, well, you as the futures community are advising this and that, and you're presenting these scenarios to us, but you know, what's your track record on being right or wrong? And you may have been wrong in the past, so why should I trust you now in what you're saying? And this is, again, probability, I think, is very important here. From a policymaking perspective, simply from a policymaking, that's what I'm talking about. It's only about how can we assist policymakers in being more assured that what they are doing is the best that can be done given the current state of knowledge and given the current state of research.
So I see no further. Okay, Christian.
Yeah, I have a question and a remark, and they are related. The question is, could you explain a little bit more the idea of red teams hunting for black swans? And because it's quite interesting. And the other thing, I would like to challenge a little bit the differentiation you made, the typology of things that were not expected happening, things or events that were expectable and those that were not expectable. I feel a little bit uneasy with that differentiation, because something has been expected or not. That is one aspect. The other aspect is the judgment to say it would have been expectable or not. And I think that differentiation, something would have been expectable or not, is not that clear. as it looks according to the examples. So I think the question is quite difficult actually to make that differentiation that something happened and we could have known it, but we didn't. And it's even more, of course, even more complicated if you try to do the same differentiation in advance. But this is more common. But maybe you can say a little bit to the red teams hunting for the black swans. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I couldn't resist using the metaphor red teams hunting for black swans. I just liked it. But I think it's more like, you know, entertaining. So the black swan events, well, you know the classical definition by Taleb, who says completely unexpected. So that in turn tells us about your second question. If something is completely unexpected, by definition, it is not expectable and it is not knowable. So we have to be surprised. There's no other way. Taleb himself qualifies the black swan by talking about 9/11 as being a black swan event. And we know by now that there was some information about it, and it wouldn't have been impossible to connect the dots, as the Senate report said. And so this is a modified version of black swans. But still, from a government's perspective or from a policymaking perspective, I would say these are the hardest nuts to crack. So these are the complicated issues. I'll give you an example. I've been writing with a colleague at SWP, a short paper about the end of democracy in the US. Scenario is pretty simple. Trump runs again in 2024, he wins. He might even win absolutely without any manipulation. He wins. And then he says 2 years later, at the 250th anniversary of the American Declaration of Independence, he will run again in 2028, and he will try to change the I think it's the 22nd Amendment to the US Constitution that prohibits presidents to be elected more than twice. Okay, so the end of American democracy. Now, that is maybe not that unexpected, but given the impact that might have, I would think it would qualify for a red swan. Now, can a government such as the German government think about such a scenario? Yes, theoretically, yes. Practically, I think it's very difficult for them to do it, because if something leaks that the German government is thinking about such a scenario, that would be not good. It might even be this is, I think, even a rather easy case. So red teaming might be something that should be done outside of governments, for instance, by institutes such as SWP or different institutes. Yes, we have red teams in the intelligence community. How good they are, that is hard to judge from the outside. But the political taboos that exist for governments and that are real and that are important, we should not, I think it would be overtasking governments when they were supposed to hunt for black swan events, particularly political black swan events. It's another thing if you're talking about a star collapsing on Earth or something like that. That's not political as important as maybe a democratic revolution in Russia or free and fair elections in China. That should be done out. Maybe it would be better to place this structure it outside of government, so to speak.
Fortunately, the coffee break is not a black swan. Okay. It's quite fixed at 11. But still, I was a bit half joking about the relation to Auftragstaktik, but I have the feeling that you have a bit of a different approach. But I was wondering whether this red teaming, which is actually a structural proposition, and to do something about the structure, and if I understand Roberto right, he's saying you should strengthen the capacity within the government to create this structure within the governments to deal with complexity. So that would be an argument against having it outside. Even so, of course, I see your point. Government is limited in what they can, because there will always be leaks and stuff. But still, I think maybe we must move into this direction. If I understand right, Roberto, is this correct? I mean, maybe you want to comment? Very briefly, because...
Well, I think very pragmatically that we need quite a lot of new tools. Red teams is just one, and red teamings are good for some part of the work. And what I proposed, like a abstract tactic or something like that, does something different. So we have literally to try to test, to experiment different roads in order to understand what works. And what may work for one government may not work for another one. And then here we are in a learning situation, first of all.
Okay, so let's go for coffee. It's half an hour. And yeah, please be back for the practitioners panel. And I think we will then join the whole roundtable immediately here. And you will not have the coffee break to reflect on your answers. Okay, thank you, everybody.